On this episode of the AVB Podcast, we are all the way here at the beautiful Capitol Theater with Mr. Robert Franz, the director of the Windsor Symphony Orchestra. Robert, how's it going?
Great, AJ, great.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us, man.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Yeah,
Welcome to our home.
Well, I have to admit right off the top, I'm very excited to be here because the show is now going into its third year, and about week 2 of year 1, I went, I might start doing something with the symphony. And just been too lazy to really reach out and say, hey, you know, let's come up with something. And luckily you guys reached out and here we are.
Boom.
So thank you for inviting us.
Absolutely.
I will start with you the same way that we start with all of our guests.
Okay.
I want to know about the house you grew up in. Tell me about mom and dad, brothers and sisters, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So I grew up in upstate New York. A little town called Kingston, which was right on the Hudson River, right across the river from Hyde Park, where Franklin Roosevelt lived and grew up. And my dad worked for IBM, and my mom and dad had me and my younger brother, and so it was just the 4 of us. When I was 11, we moved to North Carolina. My dad worked for IBM company, and at that point in the late 70s, there was a huge migration of IBM plants from the north to the south in the States, so we moved to North Carolina, so I lived there. And then, as a senior in high school, my dad got a 2-year assignment in England. So I ended up spending my senior year of high school, my grade 12 year, in England.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was there music in the house?
Yeah, there was. So first of all, we had 8-track tapes.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, yeah,
so did I.
Oh,
Yeah.
We were all about the 8-track tapes. We had a huge stack of those. And then my dad played a little guitar and sang a little. I mean, he only sang a few songs and he doesn't really read music, but he had a musical. My grandfather, his father was a banjo player, and so he grew up with music, and we had a little of that. And we used to watch, okay, so this is not your typical music director background. We used to watch Hee Haw on Sunday nights.
Oh, hell yeah.
And Lawrence Welk. And so that was my growing up musical pedigree. And I used to think, so when I started it out in elementary school on the cello, and I'd watch the woman who played cello on the Lawrence Welk show, and I said, one day, I want to sit where that woman's sitting and play on the Lawrence Welk show.
How old were you going through this?
9.
Yeah?
Yeah, 8, 9 years old.
But you appreciated it at the time?
Oh, I loved it. So there was something about, so my mom tells this story, and I don't remember this, but when I was a little kid, 3, 4 years old, she'd sit me down in front of the TV to watch Sesame Street every day, and I would play with my toys until one of the instruments came on the TV, and I would stop and just stare at the TV and listen to those sounds. And I didn't know that. You're a kid, you don't really know what's going on. When I was in 4th grade, I started on the cello. A lot of the kids in my school were starting an instrument, so I just ended up on the cello. And I remember the first day I took it home and made sounds on it for 4 hours. I walked downstairs.
First day was 4 hours?
4 hours.
Yeah.
I could not stop. I went downstairs afterwards and I said to my parents, I'm going to be a musician for the rest of my life.
No kidding.
Yeah.
You said it that early on.
It was boom.
What did they say?
They said, that's cute.
Probably still saying it.
Well, because in our family, the only people who made a living as musicians were my Aunt Shirley and Uncle Nick, who played in a band. They lived in Woodstock, New York. Right. The Woodstock.
Right.
And they were carpenters during the week, and in the weekend they would play at these bars in Woodstock. So my parents thought, I don't know if this is the kind of life we want for our son, right?
Yeah, because you had good parents.
I did. I still do. They're fantastic people. So they never really understood what a classical career would look like, especially when I was growing up. So
I don't think most people do.
They don't, right? And so I didn't have that advantage of, like, for instance, my girls now, like, if they wanted to go into music, they would know exactly where to go, what to do, how to do it.
And so, of course, they want nothing to do with music.
Pretty much. Yeah. Our oldest plays clarinet, but pretty much. But, you know, the thing is that but my parents loved that I loved music, but just didn't see any future in it.
It's interesting to me because that's a similar story that you hear for a lot of people, whether it's like rock bands or even like symphony. The orchestral stuff and the classical stuff is even more interesting to me because it's like that's one of those, like, there's an air about symphony. Yeah. You know what I mean? And the few symphony people that I've met, or the classically trained people that I met, are not much different than the guys in the rock and roll bars.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that image that people have of classical music and the symphony orchestra is really kind of just that. It's sort of an image that people have. But the reality is, in my experience, has been so different, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, we perform music of all kinds, right? We perform rock music, classical music, jazz, Broadway, vocal, opera, we do it all, right? And what I find is that people resonate with good music, no matter what it is. Right. And so it's not really a sort of like, oh, classical music is one way, or classical musicians are one way, because it's not true. We're all different.
It's funny because, like, I remember coming up in high school, and I really enjoyed theater coming through high school. I was really lucky, actually. My teacher, my theater teacher in high school was a guy named Dale Schust, who was trained by the same guy who trained Pavarotti.
Oh, wow.
So he came from a very theatrical, very operatic background, and he was really great with me in that he sort of, I think he understood my frenetic energy a little bit more than most people, and he was just like, all right, put it here, stupid. You know what I mean? Right. And I was really lucky that way. But even coming through that, knowing that like there was this, I had access to this guy who kind of knew all of that stuff. Yeah. I really enjoyed theater and theatrical music, but I could never see that as like something that I would do.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. It seemed like something that was beyond me.
Well, it's interesting you say that. People ask me all the time now, what do I need to do to become a professional musician? And I always say the first thing you have to do is in the middle of the night when you're by yourself laying in bed and your eyes are closed, do you imagine yourself being a musician on stage? That's the first step. If you can't see it, nobody's going to make it happen for you. You have to believe from the inside, from right down to your toes, that this is something you can do. And I've always believed that. I don't know why, but I always have. And even though I had no idea that I wanted to be a conductor at that point, and no idea how to become a professional musician, I knew that I had to play music. I knew that was part of who I was.
Right. So what was your path through that then?
So I started in cello in 4th grade. My teacher, it turns out my public school teacher in Kingston, her name was Willow Loescher. She was pretty darn amazing, and I didn't realize it at the time. She was a professional violinist who also taught elementary school.
Okay.
That's so rare.
Right.
I mean, that's really special.
Right.
So she saw in me an interest, and so she used to take me to her concerts, and I'd be the only, child sitting in the front row watching these concerts. It was amazing. And so that was that. Then we moved to North Carolina when I was 11, and we moved to a school that had no strings. So my parents had just bought me a cello, and they said, we're not buying another instrument. So I went to the teacher and I said, hey, listen, I really want to play in the band, but I don't have an instrument. He goes, well, there's this oboe in the closet that nobody else wants to play. Why don't you play that? So I started on oboe, and I, at first, really didn't like it. It was a very difficult instrument, but once...
Complete change, right?
I know, right? Yeah. No, I loved music. I knew music was going to be in my future. It wasn't like I was giving up on music, but the oboe was hard, right? And unpleasant, right? Very unpleasant. And so after about a year or two, I started to make pleasant sounds, and I thought, okay.
It took you 2 years, a year or two to make it...
Yes.
Yeah?
Well, because I had already started on cello, so I knew what a pleasant sound was.
Right.
It's different if you have no idea what a pleasant sound is. Right? You're just kind of like, okay, fine.
I don't even know what a good sound is.
Right?
That's hilarious.
So, so I did that, and then in high school, so again, my parents, they're very supportive of me as a human being, but didn't understand a career. So the idea of taking private lessons on oboe didn't even ring, like it wasn't even a thing, right? So when I was 16, I got a car and a job, and I started taking private lessons, paying for them myself. Okay. And then we moved to England for a year, and then then it was time to go to university. And so...
Did you play music at all in England?
Oh yeah. So it was a very musical experience. Okay. Extremely. So what was really cool was, so I didn't get into the advanced music program at the college that I went to. It was a junior college in England, so it's sixth form college, right, for juniors and seniors, grades 11 to 12. And so I didn't get into the advanced music program, so I found my own opportunity. So I joined amateur orchestras. I went to festivals and did all sorts of playing.
That's the right place to do festivals.
It's terrific. And amateur musicians, too, they're everywhere. Every community has its own amateur orchestra. Right. And which, by the way, as an aside, we just started this season, the Windsor Symphony Community Orchestra. We have an orchestra of 50 volunteers who come once a week to the Capitol Theater here to play in an orchestra.
That's amazing.
Isn't that cool?
That's really cool.
So we can talk about that more later. But anyway, that's that. But so what I did in England was I played in amateur orchestras. I had friends who were musicians, and we'd have chamber music parties about once a month. I really made my own way.
I want to go to a chamber music party.
I know, right?
How does that, it's so interesting to me because it's kind of talking about the culture of music, right? When you get into groups like that, I made a joke once to a friend of mine, and I said that really the only difference between jazz musicians and rock musicians is how public they are about their alcoholism.
Right.
And to me, it's interesting because like when you think about, or at least when I think about, and I should probably put it more on me than the general, but when I think about musicians, right, I think about musicians in a bar, and I think about, okay, what they would do afterwards and that idea.
Sure.
You hear about the rock style lifestyle and all that stuff.
Sure.
But to think about a group of classically trained musicians sort of like cutting loose on their own. Talk to me about what that experience is like, because I imagine it's very, very much communal, like with rock musicians, but I can't imagine that there isn't some interesting things that go on there.
Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's where it stems from, and I didn't understand this completely at the time, but now I see it more and more. When a musician plays in an orchestra, they have a great experience. But in the orchestra setting, the conductor really has a lot of the last say in how things are phrased, how things come together, what to do, what not to do, right? There's a lot of, in a very short rehearsal period, there's a lot of instruction that a conductor will give out to the musicians. So musicians generally look for opportunities to perform without a conductor so they can have their own sort of sense of self, their own sense of bringing music together. And that's what we were doing. We would come together and we would perform early Haydn symphonies or chamber music pieces that didn't require a conductor. And we would just make music together. And it usually focused around food. I mean, I was only 17 at the time, so it didn't really focus around alcohol, especially in my parents' house.
Right.
But it focused around food.
Okay.
And so we'd get together, we'd eat, we'd play some, we'd eat some more, we'd play some. And, you know, it's just kind of a social thing, like something that we had in common, right?
Did it feel more like practice than anything?
No,
No?
not at all.
Oh, okay.
Quite the opposite. It felt like we were playing together for fun, just for the fun of it. So we had no pressure of a concert coming up, no rehearsal, just playing to like make music together and get to know each other.
Okay.
It was really fun. And so, you know, I miss that aspect. And I think in our culture today, there's less of that than there used to be. And especially here, I mean, in England, I think it still exists a little bit more. But yeah, that culture of everybody plays an instrument and wanting to get together and make music together.
Right. It's interesting. To me, because the world seems so separate, right? Like they seem so diverted. But at the same time, anytime that, and I keep coming back to this point, I guess, but anytime that I've spent any time with musicians, you're just a bunch of musicians.
Absolutely.
Like it's the exact same thing. And it just, I wonder and I mean, we'll continue with your story here, but I wonder, like, through your journey, did you feel that separation? Like, was being part of that club a thing to you, or was it not something you even thought about?
Well, no, I did. I think sometimes. So first of all, I felt like an outsider, especially in high school, and a lot of kids in high school feel like outsiders.
Sure.
I felt like an outsider because the school that I went to in North Carolina was not filled with kids who were studying music and being classically trained and really interested in that. So when I went to England, it was my first sort of exposure to like a lot of people. And then when I eventually went to university the year after, then it was amazing. The whole world opened up. So I was suddenly surrounded by hundreds of people who thought like I did.
I think that's a pretty common experience across the board, right?
I think it is. And for me, it was pretty spectacular. I remember thinking, wow, I felt like a fish who'd been thrown back into the ocean and was finally breathing again. It was really, really nice. So it's definitely, you know, the other thing is that I think, and it's different for me now as an older person, because I'm much more confident and comfortable with myself, but I think what it is people don't necessarily understand how to approach you about what you do. Right?
Yeah.
And so they're like, oh, you're a classical musician. So I was raised Catholic, for instance. And I think it's hysterical when you bring a non-Catholic into a Catholic mass and they freak out because they're like, do I genuflect? Do I stand? What am I doing? Am I crossing? What's going on here, right? And it's the same kind of thing with classical music, and people don't always think, oh, you know what, I want to engage with this or just figure out more. Now that I'm older, it's totally different, right? Mm-hmm. But when I was younger, it was tied in with my sense of self-worth and my sense of being. And you know how it is when you're in your 20s and trying to figure out who you are.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is a world that is so, it's looked at it as so elevated. You know what I mean? Like it's looked at as intellectually elevated, and I mean it is. You have to be. I mean, in order to do symphony music, you can't just be a guy who picked up well, first of all, nobody's just a guy who picked up a cello.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. So it's interesting. It is a high art form. There's no question. Right? But there's something very interesting that happens. So when you start out, you're learning all of the details, and it really does feel like an enormous intellectual and physical exercise. I mean, it's really. But then you get to the other side when you have all of that stuff sort of in control, and all of a sudden you start to understand the simplicity of it, the humanity of it, just the sort of everydayness about it. I mean, honestly, most people who know me personally think of me as just kind of an everyday, average kind of guy. I mean, I take out the garbage, I wash the dishes, and I just happen, by the way, to conduct symphony orchestras around the world.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this summer I painted my house as a project, just like a normal human being would, except that I was on a 30-foot ladder for most of the time.
Right. So you get through university.
Yes.
You're doing your training.
Well, so what happened was I was in the middle of my undergraduate, working on my degree in oboe performance, and halfway through I decided I'm going to take a conducting class just to see what it's like.
Okay.
And I took the class, learned the basic patterns, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be an oboist in an orchestra, I should know what it's like to be on the other side of the podium, right? So I remember the first day I stood up and I conducted the beginning of Beethoven's Second Symphony.
Can I stop you for a second? Because that is an interesting thought. I don't think everybody has that thought.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I think the majority of musicians who end up sitting on the other side of the conductor don't have that thought whatsoever.
I think that's true in life, right? And when you look at successful people, what they want to do is they want to understand a problem or a situation from as many different perspectives as possible. And I think that was really, first of all, I think that's a gift from my parents who taught me that skill. I mean, that was very much, when I grew up, I would do something and my dad would say, okay, that's fine, but what if you looked at it this way? What if you did it this way? What if you, could it be better? It was always a could it be better kind of situation. And he did it with love. I mean, it was always like that. It didn't feel like love always, you know what I mean? But he did it with love. But yeah, so it's interesting you say that because I often look at the qualities of what I consider to be successful people. Mm-hmm. Successful people, to me, are always trying to learn something new. They're always trying to get a different vantage point, a different perspective on things. They're always not uncomfortable with what they know, but always willing to test what they know.
Right.
And that's really where that started for me. And I still do that today.
Do you remember when you first recognized that as being a thing?
Yes, but it was after university.
That's fine.
It was much after university.
Okay.
So yeah, I do. What happened was I'll just quickly tell you that I finished my undergrad in oboe.
Sure.
I decided I wanted to become a conductor after conducting an orchestra in that class.
Yep.
And I stayed and did a master's degree in conducting.
Okay.
I got out of university with 2 degrees, a bachelor's in oboe and a master's in conducting. No hope of getting a job.
You ended up getting your master's in conducting?
I did.
Okay.
Which is normal. It's pretty typical.
No, but I thought, were you going after your master's in oboe first?
No.
Okay.
So my undergrad, my bachelor's, I was doing in oboe, and then when I about halfway through that, I decided I really want to switch to conducting in my graduate degree.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Sorry, we're tangent
I know, it's totally fine. It's totally fine. It's totally great. I'm with you. So there were a number of things that happened after university. Most prominently was that I didn't get a job because you have to get experience, get a job, and a job to get experience.
Yeah.
But it was later in life, about 7 or 8 years after I got out of university, where I was having some problems in my body. My arm had seized up. I had a lot of tension. And I started working with the person that I consider probably the most influential person in my life, my teacher, but he was not a conducting teacher. Joe was very interesting. The guy that I worked with, Joe Gifford, had a really incredible background. He studied with Martha Graham in the 40s.
Okay.
In the 50s and 60s, he was a modern dancer in New York, in a company and on Broadway.
Wow.
And in the 70s and 80s, he taught movement to actors and singers at Boston University. In the 90s...
He dealt with a lot of major names going through
A lot of major names.
Yeah.
In fact, when I met Jason Alexander a couple of years ago, we found out that we both studied with Joe.
Oh, that's great.
For instance. So in the 90s, Joe started working with conductors.
Okay.
And I ran across him at another festival I was doing and met him, and I said, you know what, I need to work with you because I'm having tension problems and I'm having, I don't feel like I'm really in touch with myself when I'm conducting. Like I knew the technique of it, but I couldn't connect up my soul, my core of who I was. Now at the time I didn't know that's what the problem was, but he helped me detect that. So Joe was a Reiki master. He knew Joe Pilates. He did Alexander technique. I mean, he was like guru kind. So I call him really my life coach more than my conducting teacher. But I worked with him every year for about 15 years until he passed away just a couple of years ago. And what I learned from Joe goes back to what you and I were talking about, and that is that to be successful, you have to come from a sense of humility. You have to come from a sense of working really hard. I mean, you have to have all of the skills, but then you have to put those aside, and you have to be in the moment, and you have to live in the moment, and you have to experience things, and you have to be curious. You have to be curious about what you're doing and who you are and what's going on around you. Otherwise, without that curiosity, you're nothing. You're just a machine that repeats techniques and ideas and thoughts.
That being said, through your journey, because now we've talked to you all the way through school, and now that we're 7 years past school, I'm assuming there's a bunch of information we've skipped right past, right? So coming through all of that, you've said something that's very important, but I know that journey.
Yes.
And at least I know that journey from what I've gone through. Let me ask you a question. As a kid who, how old were you when you said I'm going to be a professional? You said
9.
9 years old. At 9 years old, you said I'm going to be a professional musician. In the 7 years when you realized all of these things and this is what it takes to be successful, how many times did you tell yourself you were wasting your time?
Never, not once.
I think that might be a major difference between you and a lot of artists, man. A big difference.
It never dawned on me that failure was not an option.
Right.
It was not an option. And you know, it was interesting. So going back to getting out of university, when I got out of university with my 2 degrees and couldn't get a job, my parents were like, so how does this work?
Right.
And I said, I don't know, really. So
Come back to that question from when you were 9, right?
Exactly. So I started my own orchestra out of university because I thought, well, if nobody's going to hire me, I'll just start my own. How hard can it be?
Okay.
And, you know, I didn't know the answer to that question,
right.
so I just did it. But in order to feed myself and live, I had 6 other part-time jobs.
Yep.
And so I was doing a million different things. And I had the attitude then, and I still have it pretty much now. If somebody asks you to do it and you can do it, do it. Just experience it. You don't think too much about whether, does this fit into my journey and does this whatever. Just do it, right?
Right.
So a lot of things came through my life in those 7 years between meeting Joe and graduating from university. I went and did a rural residency program that the National Endowment for the Arts sponsored in the States. So I lived in Kansas for a year, in Georgia for a year.
And what does that mean?
So I was in a small ensemble, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon. I was the oboist. And we went in residence in Liberal, Kansas, tiny little town in Kansas, middle of nowhere.
It's called, like the name of the town is Liberal?
I know, right? Exactly. Now it's called Liberal, not because of its politics.
Sure.
But because it was the closest place where the aquifer under the ground came to the earth.
Okay.
And it was on the Santa Fe Trail, and you could get a liberal quantity of water for your horse.
Okay. That's hilarious. Okay.
Well, it's the middle of the prairie and desert, so there's no water anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a big deal, right?
Right.
So yeah, I did those. And basically what it was we went in and we performed in the community in all sorts of venues. We performed in the schools. I learned how to create integrated programs, music in the schools. I learned how to connect with community members who didn't know anything about classical music and just, build that bridge between classical music and audience.
So were you aware that you were becoming a program director while you were doing all of this stuff, or was it just by necessity?
No. I was aware because I had already gotten the degree in conducting and I had started my own orchestra.
Okay.
So yes, it was all combined for me. Yeah. But it seemed like it was far off. Like it's not the typical path of a conductor. A conductor doesn't go live in Liberal, Kansas for a year. Okay. Usually.
Gotcha.
So I did that for a couple of years, and because of that, when I came back to Winston-Salem, where I went to school, and where my chamber orchestra was based, the symphony.
You had a chamber orchestra in Winston-Salem.
Yeah, in Winston-Salem. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got all kinds of ghost stories to talk about, but anyway, that's another thing.
I know, right? So when I went back, the Winston-Salem Symphony, the big symphony in town, had gotten a grant to start a research project to put a wind quintet in residence in an elementary school to see if we could affect test scores of young kids by listening to classical music.
Okay.
And because I had been creating that kind of programming, I was hired as the oboist, but also as the person who kind of built the programs.
Okay.
And so I ran a research project. I knew nothing about education and nothing about research, but I did it anyway. And simultaneously, we got hired by a school for physically and mentally disabled children to do a residency. I knew nothing about that. I just went in and figured it out as I went. Things were coming left and right to me.
This is going to probably put the brakes on this for a second, but all I want to know is the results of your research.
Okay, yeah, fine.
Yeah.
I can say it. So in our elementary school, 44% of the kids were passing the state standardized test when we got there. After 3 years, 88% of them passed the state standardized test.
Get out of here.
I'm out of here.
For real?
For real.
What's the sample size?
It was, each grade was like 20 kids, and we had 3 classes in each grade level. So we had, 90 to 100 kids per grade level. So we had about 300 kids that we were working with.
And how long did the program run?
So the program that I was involved with, it was the first 3 years. It continued on for another decade or so just to work there. But that was our first benchmark.
Right.
We sent in a neurologist from the Bowman Gray School of Medicine after the 3 year because we didn't know exactly what we had done to sort of analyze the kids and us and blah, blah.
Right.
He discovered that what we had done, the best of his ability to understand what we had done, was that we had developed high-level active listening skills in the kids.
Okay.
Turns out that active listening is one of the keys to being a good reader. And so our kids developed reading skills 1, 2, and 3 grade levels above their grade level. And of course, once a child starts reading well, then there's no stopping.
Everything else just keeps going.
Yeah, it keeps going. And so based on that, AJ, and this is what was really extraordinary for me, was I started creating education programs for orchestras that I conducted based on the active listening model. So we would, instead of playing a piece and saying, oh, this is a piece in minor key, how sad is it, or happy,
right.
I would say, what do you hear? Is it a high pitch, middle pitch, low pitch? Is it loud? Is it soft? Is it fast? Is it slow? What is the composer doing? Is the composer using the same idea or changing the idea? What's going on in the energy of the piece? Very specific ways of listening. And truthfully, that ability, not my conducting ability, but that education ability is what got me my first real job as a conductor, where I got paid. And that was as assistant conductor of the Louisville Orchestra. And I was about 29 years old when I won that job.
That's young for that, right?
It was young for it, and it was a big job, and I knew very little about
How big is that orchestra? Because Louisville's not it's not a podunk town.
Yeah, it's a full-time orchestra.
Right.
And they have a good sized season. So it was it was a good job.
Yeah.
It was a good job. And it really launched a lot of things for me.
It's funny that you talk about active listening because I've had this conversation sort of on the side here and there. Coming up through music, like I started as a punk rock drummer. Like to tell you how different our musical journeys are. I started as a punk rock drummer, and to me, music was mostly noise, like mostly message on a noise.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the noise to me was never all like the way you and George love music. I never had that.
Yeah.
Right. Until like 3 or 4 years ago when I became the front man of a band and I started learning to really play guitar rather than just pounding on drums. Right.
Right.
And over that journey, I noticed I noticed my ability to hear things were different.
Yeah.
Like just there's a tone that I didn't know existed.
Yeah.
And like, how could I even just find that? So your research found that through the way that you listen and the way you train your ear, basically.
Yep. We could help mind map with these kids. And so it really developed their active listening. And active listening is key to so many things. It's key to being appreciative of classical music, first of all, or any kind of music, right? You have to be able to listen to what you're hearing, not just experience it and let it wash over you like the great unwashed, but actually engage with it. In order to engage with music, you have to be able to understand what you're hearing and how to hear it, right?
Was the study that you were specifically involved with then developed or combined with other studies to?
There was a book that was written about the process called The Well-Tempered Mind. And It was written by Peter Perret and Janet Fox. Peter was the music director of the Winston Symphony, whose brainchild this was to start. I was just brought in to execute. It was his brainchild. But what I would say is myself and members of the original quintet, did a lot of training around the country of other musicians in other places that wanted to develop this program. And I would say probably most importantly, my work with orchestras. I do concerts for about 60 or 70,000 kids a year now, and I've been doing that for about 20 years. And all of that work is based on the model that I developed with the Bolton Project.
What kind of interaction do you have when you do these? When you do the performances with kids, do you have much direct interaction with them?
Absolutely. So the way I do it is, for instance, I'm the associate conductor of the Houston Symphony also, in addition to music director of the Windsor Symphony.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, so I go down there 10, 12 weeks a year. And our hall down there seats 3,000. So we'll have 2,500, 2,600 kids. And what I'll do is we'll play a piece and then I'll ask them questions. Who can tell me, what instrument was featured, or what instrument did you hear, or, leading questions. And I'll pick a child out of the audience or out of the balcony to answer the question. So there's a lot of that. And then just before the last piece, I take a moment and let them ask us questions on stage, anything that they want. So it's an engaging, interactive kind of process.
What's the best question you've ever been asked?
Why do you wear black?
Get out of here.
That was good question, but it was the answer that was, I think, more funny.
Okay.
So the kid just said to me, he goes, "Hey, why do you guys all wear black?" I said, "Because it's slimming." Because they always ask, like, "How much money do you make?" I'm like, "Enough to eat 3 meals a day. We're doing fine."
Right.
Thank you very much. But they do ask really, like, so for instance, last week I was in Houston and we did concerts for middle and high schoolers who are actually all playing instruments. So we do a special set of concerts for middle and high school kids who are playing their instruments, and we want to engage them more and help bring them to the next level. And they ask very specific questions about bowing techniques and bow holds and things that they heard or saw, and it was very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you when you're dealing with I almost get the feeling,
yes,
right, that the joy or gratitude or whatever you want to call it that most musicians would get from just performing on stage, you don't get that nearly as much as you get it when you're dealing directly with the kids.
I would say both are true for me.
Yeah.
So very much when I'm making music with my colleagues and we are in the moment and we're experiencing something deeply and profoundly and in a different way than we've ever experienced before, I'm there, and it's one of the biggest charges of my entire life. Mm-hmm. But when I'm also able to turn around and connect with another human being, other than the musicians, who are, by the way, human beings.
Sometimes.
When I'm able to turn around and connect with an audience member, I do enjoy that very much too. So I enjoy both. I really need both,
right,
to be successful. And I feel like my job is really to be that bridge, that conduit between our audience and our musicians, to kind of bring that together. So in a way, my job as music director of the Windsor Symphony is not just to conduct the orchestra, but it's to be the musical ambassador for not only the orchestra, but the community. In a way, when you're music director of the symphony in the community, you're kind of like, you're the musical ambassador. You're the one that, like, when the mayor has a question about symphony orchestra's role in a community, he asks me, right? Like, I mean, it's that kind of platform from which to kind of develop.
How do you... Sorry, I'm battling with how to ask this question.
Anyway, it's fine.
How do you sort of take that role?
I would say the quick answer is very seriously. Here's what I tell people, and this is, I think, absolutely true of me. I take my work exceedingly seriously. I work very hard. Yesterday, I did 14 hours between rehearsals and visiting schools and doing master classes and all sorts of things. What I don't take seriously is myself. I take my work very seriously, but I don't take myself very seriously. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I see it as my responsibility to stay connected with the other musicians in the community, with the students who are studying music in the community, and community members at large, not only our audience, but other people. I mean, we, here at the Windsor Symphony, we not only perform for people who come to the Capitol Theater, but we go out and we perform over 100 concerts a year out in the community throughout Windsor and Essex County. And so my role, our role, is to connect through music with as many different people as we can. But I take it, and I'm not exactly sure how to say this, but I'll say that when you're the music director of the symphony, there's a certain expectation that your sense and understanding of music and your musical taste is sort of a leading force in the community. And so I try to, with as much humility as possible, be a resource and helpful to any musicians in the community who I feel like I can help. So for instance, last night right here at the Capitol Theater, we partnered with Bridged Opera. Aaron D.K. Armstrong runs this organization. They do opera. There are a number of singers in our community who are professional, who've done their education, but they don't have graduate professional development opportunities. So I offered a master class. And so I had 5 professional singers sing for me last night, and we did a master class on stage right here at the Capitol Theater.
That must have been amazing.
I love it. And
right?
I'm not a singer. I'm not trained as a vocalist, but I'm a musician, right? Mm-hmm. And so I can listen and go, okay, so here are the things that I'm not understanding. Here's in the music, this isn't going on. And also my work with Joe was so universal in terms of tapping into the core and really finding your center and simplifying and letting yourself become the vessel for the music as opposed to making the music happen.
I really want to talk about this because okay. I come from a place where, and I've said this a couple times now on the show, if you would have talked to me 10 years ago and said the words that you just said, the conversation would have been over.
Right.
I can't even, I'd finding your core, whatever. You can't get to work, stupid.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Talk to me about what you're talking to me about without saying it like that.
In order to be a successful musician, you have to go from the personal to the impersonal. Now, this is super contradictory to our minds. We think when you see a musician up there, of course they're emoting and they're expressing themselves. But really what we are doing is we are trying to understand the composer's intention and bring it to the audience in as pure and clear a way as possible. That's why we rehearse, that's why we study, that's why we work to be able to do that. In the act of doing that, we become not the creator, but the vessel for the creation to emerge and come out to our audience. And so in order to be able to do that, I have to be really quiet inside. I meditate before concerts and before rehearsals. I have to find that place in me that is not about Robert and his ego and what I want to do, but what am I trying to accomplish, and keep it focused on the act, the art of music and conducting.
So I'm not sure if I'm either misunderstanding what you're saying or if we've just discovered the fundamental difference between symphony and like rock music. Okay. Right? Because to me, I always go back to, if I quote anybody, it's usually Penn Jillette. He's kind of my spirit animal.
Got it.
And what I'm about to quote is a quote. He's quoting somebody else, and much like him, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like, I'll miss the quote. But the quote that I always fall back onto is this. Is the idea that the artist's job is to stand naked on stage. Now, that's a metaphor, obviously, but they took it very literal for a specific photograph. But so is that, like, are you talking about the parallel differences between those two?
No, I'm talking about that exact that vulnerability. Okay. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to go in the moment. You have to be able to let go of your past. Let go of, like, okay, so I've conducted this way every time for the last 25 years. Oh, what if something new appears? What's going on? Where is the magic? Where's the special artistic quality that's in there? You know, you're right. Here's at the end of the day, for me personally, conducting is a spiritual activity. Okay. It's a moment when I get to go back in touch with my core, when I get to take away all the everyday, like doing the dishes, taking out the garbage, all the other stuff I have to do, and I get to reconnect with my spirit animal, whatever that is. But for me, but that sort of sense of self, that sense of like coming back into myself and starting afresh and starting anew. And that to me is what's so exciting and invigorating about music. It's not just that I get to stand up, wave my arms around and take a bow, but it's that when I do that, I become more in contact with who I am as a person.
And how often do you think about that?
Often. Yeah. Lots and lots. So Joe, my teacher, just passed away a year and a half ago. And so of late, that's been particularly important on my mind because, you know, it's interesting. When you have someone in your life that passes on, that is that important to you, you have a couple of options of ways that you can deal with it. You can just put it out of your mind. You can go into a deep depression. My choice was to take what I've learned and really amplify it and pass it on. Joe's ideas live through me, and they will live through my students, and they will pass on. And by the way, that's one of the things that's so exciting about classical music to me. Mm-hmm. Classical music has been passed on one person to another for hundreds of years. That's how classical music is taught. It's not taught in a big classroom or in a big, it's one person and another person in a room communicating with each other, sharing what happened. And so there's a direct lineage. You feel that when you study, when you make music, you feel that lineage.
It's so interesting to me because it's the symphony has always been, the symphony and theater to me, I think I combine the two very often, but it has always been this world that, even though like I came up in theater a little bit and I understand theater, it always still seemed like just this side of who I was and what I did. Of course. But it was so fascinating to me, and I think what interests me or what excites me about our conversation thus far is that how exactly the same what you're doing is compared to just about every other art every other art form.
That's exactly right. There's a great commonality about it. To be extraordinary this is one of my little mantras. To be extraordinary is not particularly special. To be ordinary is extraordinary. And that's really, if you can live that, if you can live that you are just a normal human being who's experiencing things, and yes, I don't think I was divinely inspired or hit by a thunderbolt or anything that happened to make me who I am today. I think I worked my butt off. Mm-hmm. I know I worked my butt off. And I earned everything that I'm doing today, but that doesn't take away the fact that I'm just an ordinary human being who just happens to have this skill set.
Well, outside of the important conversation that
Yes.
I think we just had, let's talk about the stuff that has to be talked about when we come and do this stuff. So you get hired by the Windsor Symphony Orchestra. When did that happen for you?
That happened in 2013. So what happened is when you get hired as a music director, it's a 2-year process.
Okay.
Right? So you apply, they go through the interviewing process. There were 157 people from around the world who applied for this job. Yeah. This is not a field that's for the faint of heart.
Is that not uncommon when it comes to?
That's super common.
Yeah.
That's super common.
And you're competing. You're literally competing with people from around the world.
Literally.
Okay.
So did that. Went through the interview process, and then they decided that 8 of us they cut from 157 down to 8, which takes about 6 months to 8 months, and then they bring you in for a season. So they set that up before the season starts. So I came in January of 2013. I was number 8 of 8. And then after that, the committee meets and they decide which of them they want to offer a contract to. And lucky for me, they offered it to me the next month.
Wait, when you come in for a year?
No, so I came in for a week. But it took a year to prepare for that. So there were 8 one-week visits.
Gotcha, because I'm like, this was a 9-year process?
No.
Yeah.
2-year process.
Yeah.
But so I won the job in February of 2013, and I didn't start till September of 2013. So I applied in somewhere around the fall of 2011.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a 2-year process. So
real just minutia question.
Yep.
You're the director of the Windsor Symphony
Yes.
Orchestra. Who hires that guy?
Okay, so that's a good question. The way any orchestra in Canada works is that there's a volunteer group of community members who make up the board of directors. Okay. Those people actually oversee the organization, and they hire 2 people. They hire a music director to oversee the artistic and an executive director to oversee the administrative. Okay. The executive director and I are on the same page. We're equals in the structure. So the board of directors says, we'd like to hire you. Well, the committee recommends me, right? The search committee. The board says, we'd like to hire you. We'll give you a 3-year contract. So they give me a 3-year contract. So we work out the terms, and then at the end of the 3 years.
Wait, how much money did you make? No, sorry.
At the end of 3 years, enough to eat 3 meals a day. Right. At the end of the 3 years, the board and I decide, do I want to keep this job? Do they want to keep me on at this job? And then we renegotiate another contract.
Gotcha.
And that's how it works.
Cool. So I know we've got an exciting new season coming out.
We do. So next year, every year, so the way it works is April through December, we program for the following season. Okay. So December 2018, we finished the 2019-2020 season programming. Okay. So next year we have a couple of big things. One, we've got in September opening night for our pop series. We're going to be doing Windsor Essex's Got Talent contest, and we're going to have 4 or 5 contestants on each concert that are going to compete for first place on their days, and then there'll be a grand prize winner chosen from the 2, and that person will get one of the halls here in the Capitol Theater to make their debut performance for free. So they'll get to use the hall to have a concert or a party or whatever their talent is, they can do it. We've got 3 different options here so they can choose.
That's awesome.
Isn't that cool?
That's really cool.
So we're doing that. And
that's open to not just symphony musicians.
No, it's not. It's open to non-professional musicians, or not even musicians. It could be actors, it could be jugglers, it could be circus acts, it could be all sorts of things.
Oh, that's amazing! Yeah.
So really, a total Got Talent kind of process. Mm-hmm. And then the other big thing that's happening next year, and this is in our Masterwork series, which is more of our classical side. Mm-hmm. We're performing Giacomo Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly. So every other year we do an opera, and in the in-between years, I audition singers throughout Ontario, We just had the audition a couple of months ago. We had 77 singers audition for me, and I chose from that an amazing cast to sing Madame Butterfly here on the stage of the Pentastar.
That's amazing. When is that? When is that?
That is going to be in January of 2020.
Ooh, lots to look forward to.
I know, right?
And lots in between too, right?
Lots in between. So all sorts of stuff. I mean, you name it. What we try to do is we try to make our programming as diverse as possible so that there's really something for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of which, like you won't see it because it's a black and white show, but these banners behind us, lots of color here. I was talking with Giovanni before we sat down. You've got kids programming on the weekend.
That's exactly right. So what we do in this space, which is our Kelly Theater, which is our middle-sized space, seats about 200, is we do concerts for kids, young kids, 0 to 4 years old. And they can come here. We'll have one of our ensembles play. Our assistant conductor, Daniel Wiley, will narrate, and there'll be this sort of communication with the orchestra. It's really fun.
That's great. Is that part of, like, is that coming from you? Is that one of those teaching kids things?
Well, the orchestra was already doing that. I mean, I have my hand a little bit in the direction it goes, but it really is something the organization has felt committed to. And by the way, the reason this organization hired me is because they're as committed to education and community outreach as I am. That's why I was the right fit for this orchestra.
All right. No, that's amazing. Is there anything that I've missed? Is there something that we should tell people or how can people find out more about you or the symphony?
Here's what people need to do. 2 things. 1, go to windsorsymphony.com.
Okay.
That's the easiest thing. You'll see all of our concerts. 2, come try us out. Just come visit. The only thing you need to know when you walk in the door of the Capitol Theater is that if you have a sense of curiosity, we will take care of the rest. And that is all. I mean, it's not a place where you have to worry about whether you clap or don't clap, where you clap, where you sit, where you stand. You don't have to genuflect here, none of that kind of stuff.
I got to put a bow tie on.
Yeah, no, you don't have to wear a bow tie. You can come very casually. People dress in all manners. You know, I would say try it. I'll give you a great example of this. I didn't grow up Canadian, so I did not grow up with a hockey background.
Right.
When I moved to Buffalo, I conducted in Buffalo for a while. The Sabres were a big deal. So I went to my first Sabres game, right? And I had never seen a professional hockey game before.
Right.
I was blown away to see it in real life and the communication between those guys and the way they connected without
it's
looking
very musical when you really watch it, right?
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It was amazing. And I tell people that all the time. I say, you know what, if you want a similar experience and you've never experienced it, come to the symphony and watch these 45, 50 musicians on stage, and I really rock it out with our performances of these pieces.
Well, I know I certainly can't wait to come and check it out for sure.
Perfect, AJ. Appreciate it.
Thank you for hanging out with us. All right, folks, that is another episode of the AVB Podcast. Thanks for hanging out with us this time. Be sure to check out the extra videos and stuff that are along the sides or that are popping up. And of course, down below, there are lots of links to our sponsors, of course, to the Symphony and to us as well. You can go make sure while you're down there, you also click the subscribe button. Mumbling over myself as I often do. Thanks for hanging out with us, folks. We'll see you next time. That'll do it for this episode of the AVB Podcast. Don't forget you can subscribe to our full audio episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you find your audio podcasts. The full episodes, highlights, and our live off-the-floor performance videos can be found at our YouTube channel, and you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at the AVB Podcast. Of course, you'll find links to our incredible sponsors and this week's guest in the description below. The AVB Podcast is part of the Border City Network. Find more great content at bordercitynetwork.com. See you next time, folks. Bye-bye.